अस्सलाम वालेकुम जी। ऑर्गेनाइजेशनल साइकोलॉजी, personality. We had just finished measuring personality in our last lecture. Closely related to personality, which impacts personality, and today's topic, impact organizational psychology, is the topic of attitude. हमारा रवैया जो है उसके बारे में आज हम आगाही हासिल करेंगे। रवैया हमारी शख्सियत का एक अहम जुज़ है और आप जानते हैं कि शख्सियत का किसी इदारे पर, किसी स्कूल पर, कॉलेज पर, अस्पताल पे, मैन्युफैक्चरिंग ऑर्गेनाइजेशन सच एज ए शू मेकिंग फैक्ट्री और एन आइसक्रीम मेकिंग फैक्ट्री, इन तमाम जगहों पे एक शख्सियत का बहुत गहरा असर हो सकता है और उस शख्सियत की जो एक खुसूसियत है वो है एटीट्यूड. Attitude is a component part of personality, and personality influences organization and organizational psychology, and that is the relevance of attitude that we are going to talk about as a subject within the realm of organizational psychology. इससे पहले कि हम एटीट्यूड के बारे में आपसे कुछ बातचीत करें, let us first review what we talked about in the last lecture related to personality. Personality से मुतल्लिक हमने पिछली दफे आपको जो एक अहम तरीन बात बताई थी वो थी measurement of personality, कि personality की जांच या पैमाइश कैसे की जाती है. और इससे मुतल्लिक हमने आपको बताया था कि इसके बहुत से टेस्ट्स बन चुके हैं और बहुत अरसे से इसकी पैमाइश माहिरीन नफ्सियात कर रहे हैं, लेकिन अब 21वीं सदी के शुरू में अगर हम मेजर्स ऑफ पर्सनालिटी का एक बर्ड्स आई व्यू लें, एक जायजा लें, तो हम देखेंगे that there are three main categories of measures of personality that we talked about in the last lecture. Quickly review that and then we will go forward of that. The first category, as you remember, is what is called the category of objective tests, जिसमें हमने माहिरीन नफ्सियात ने ऐसी पैमाइशें बनाई हैं जो मेजर करती हैं the presence of or absence of certain traits and qualities in a person, and then the magnitude or the quantity of those traits and qualities in the person. For instance, whether a person is suffering from a certain mental disease or not, whether a person has a certain type of personality or not, for instance, extroversion and introversion, for instance, presence or absence of hysteria. These are what are called the objective tests. Then we talked about the second category, which we called the situational tests. Situational tests measure, quantify personality in a given situation. How does a person behave, for instance, vis-a-vis a leader? What is his behavior when other people are present in an organization? Is he an obedient oriented person? आपको याद होगा, आपने सोशल साइकोलॉजी में पढ़ा होगा, बहुत मशहूर एक्सपेरिमेंट्स हैं स्टैनले मिलग्रैम के, जिसमें उन्होंने ये देखा था that people follow orders without questioning the validity of those orders. And this is a kind of a situational test that we are talking about, where a person is put in a situation and then his reaction is measured in that situation. We talked about sociometry as one of the situational tests, and we also talked about the category system as another situational test. Then, of course, the third kind of test that we talked about in measuring personality was described as projective tests. Projective tests are those tests that measure the hidden part of personality. जो शख्सियत का मख्फी पहलू है, पोशीदा पहलू है, जिसके बारे में वो सब्जेक्ट, वो शख्स खुद भी नहीं जानता, उसके बारे में उसकी अपनी आगाही जो है वो भी महदूद है, ऐसे पर्सनालिटी के हिस्से, शख्सियत के हिस्से भी ये टेस्ट जो हैं ये मेजर कर लेते हैं, एंड दीज टेस्ट्स आर कॉल्ड प्रोजेक्टिव टेस्ट्स. आई गेव यू द एग्जांपल ऑफ TAT or thematic apperception test in this regard, and then I gave you the example of ISB or incomplete sentence blank in this regard. These are the three types of measures of personality that we talked about, and I showed you how psychologists may use these or other tests to measure those important 5 big variables or other variables in the personality that impact an organization. वो 5 big याद हैं आपको? Agreeableness, conscientiousness वगैरह वगैरह. पर्सनैलिटी टेस्ट्स के जरिए, पर्सनैलिटी मेजर्स के जरिए हम शख्सियत के किसी भी पहलू की पैमाइश कर सकते हैं और फिर ये देख सकते हैं कि क्या एक शख्स एक ऑर्गेनाइजेशन के लिए, एक इदारे के लिए अच्छा होगा, बुरा होगा, और किस हद तक वो अच्छा या बुरा होगा. After having seen what we talked about in the last lecture, let us go forward and take a look at another important variable in organizational psychology, and that is attitudes. एटीट्यूड का अगर हम उर्दू में तर्जुमा करें तो इसका तर्जुमा है रवैया. प्लीज डू नॉट कंफ्यूज एटीट्यूड विद एप्टीट्यूड. एप्टीट्यूड इज रुझान, एटीट्यूड इज रवैया. मेरा आपसे पहला सवाल यह है कि आप मुझे यह बताइए कि क्या आपके ख्याल में एटीट्यूड जो है हम पैदाइशी तौर पे हासिल करते हैं या एटीट्यूड जो है ये बनता है जिंदगी में? आपका क्या ख्याल है? और फिर मुझे यह भी बताइए कि आपके ख्याल में रुझान जो है, एप्टीट्यूड, क्या वो पैदाइशी तौर पे एक शख्स में मौजूद होता है या क्या वो भी जिंदगी के साथ साथ, नशो नुमा के साथ साथ बदलता जाता है और बढ़ता चला जाता है? क्या ख्याल है आपका? आप जो अंदाजा लगा रहे हैं वो ठीक अंदाजा लगा रहे हैं. एटीट्यूड इज समथिंग दैट इज एक्वायर्ड, दैट इज लर्न्ड. We are not born with an attitude. If a person is born in, for instance, a country like the United States of America, he would in all probability be a Christian. His attitude towards church would be positive. If a person is born in, for instance, a country like Pakistan, he would be, in all probability, be a Muslim, and his attitude towards the mosque would be positive. The attitude of the person that's born in America towards a mosque, we don't know whether it's going to be positive or negative. Similarly, the attitude of a person born in a country like Pakistan, we don't know what his attitude might be towards a place like a church. But we know that because he is born in a Christian-dominated society, and when we know that if another person is born in a Muslim-dominated society, a person who is born in the Christian-dominated society, his attitude towards Christianity and church would be positive. And a person who is born in the Muslim community or country, his attitude towards a mosque and Muslims would be positive. So we are not talking about we are not talking about inheriting an attitude. It is what we learn. Whereas rujhan or aptitude is like some people have athletic aptitude, some people are non-athletic. आपने बच्चे देखे होंगे जो ज्यादा खेल कूद की तरफ माइल हैं और जो भाग दौड़ में ज्यादा वक्त लगाते हैं, और कुछ बच्चे ऐसे हैं जो अपनी आप में मसरूफ रहते हैं, कभी किताब पढ़ ली या कभी उठ के टीवी देख लिया, लेकिन खेल कूद में भागने दौड़ने में उनका ध्यान नहीं होता, विच मीन्स दैट दे आर लेस एथलेटिक. You must have seen people who are very good in picking up notes of melodies, who can sing very well, and you must have seen people who have learnt music but still can't make as good music. These are examples of aptitude. Those children who are born with athletic aptitudes excel in sports, and those children or people who are born with a musical aptitude excel in music. Aptitude, therefore, is something that we inherit. Now, we are not talking about aptitude. We will talk about aptitude in the relevant section when we come to that. For the time being, we are talking about attitude. रवैया हम सीखते हैं. We socially learn attitudes. It is nothing inborn. Once we have learned attitudes or an attitude, it has three components. There are three parts to an attitude. What are those three parts? Number one, it makes us think in a certain way. My attitude towards my religion makes me think in a positive manner towards religion. It makes me think, my cognition, my thinking is affected by my attitude. Or you can say that an attitude has a cognitive or a thinking component, a thinking part of it. Other part of an attitude is what is called the conative part, the behavioral part of an attitude. Attitude makes a person behave in a certain way. It not only makes person thinks in a certain way, it also makes him behave in a certain way. A person's attitude towards his religion is positive. It makes him think positive about religion, and it also makes him behave positively towards religious symbols or religious personalities or religious books. So the second component of an attitude is the behavior, the conative part of it. And the third component of attitude is what's called the affective component. It makes a person feel in a certain way. The third element or the third part or the third component of an attitude is the feeling, the sentiment, the emotional component of an attitude. All attitudes have an emotional or a feeling component attached to them. A positive attitude has positive affective or positive feelings attached to it, and a negative attitude has negative feelings attached to it. If a person has a positive attitude for a person or an ideology or an object, he will feel pleasant emotions about that person, that object, or that ideology. If a person has a negative attitude about a person or an object or an ideology, he will feel negative emotions towards the person, the ideology, or the object. And that is what is meant by the affective part of an attitude. Attitude then is something that is the part and parcel of a personality, which a person learns, which makes him behave in a certain way, which makes him think in a certain way, and which makes him feel in a certain way. You may have, or a person may have, negativity or positivity related to attitudes. In organizational psychology, we say there are two aspects to an attitude. That is, positive effectivity. Positive effectivity of an attitude refers to a feeling of well-being, a feeling of being involved pleasantly in life situations, a feeling of pleasure being part of an organization. And then you have negative effectivity, whereas a person may feel distressed, worried, tense, or nervous in an organization because of a certain negativity or negative effectivity. Attitude of a person, therefore, tremendously influences his overall well-being, his relationship with other people in an organization, his mental or physical health, his being able to do or not do good work in the organization, his productivity or lack of productivity in an organization. That is how important attitude is. What are some of the functions of an attitude? Attitude हमारे लिए क्या functions perform कर रहा है किसी शख्स के लिए? अगर हम देखें तो attitude जो है वो बहुत से functions perform करता है, लेकिन we need to look at three functions of attitude. The first is the adjustment function. Attitude helps to adjust a person. My positive attitude towards my fellow worker, towards my organization, helps me to get adjusted to the organization. A person who has a negative attitude, that attitude would hinder his adjustment to the organization and other people in the organization. So, one of the functions of attitude is that it creates, helps adjustment in an organization. दूसरा function जो है attitude का, that is what is called ego defense function. Attitude helps to defend a person. Attitude is a kind of a shield that a person can use. My positive attitude towards my organization makes me overlook certain painful things related to an organization. The painful things might be that the organization does not pay as much as other organizations do. And that is a painful perception to have, or a painful knowledge to have, but my attitude defends me against this pain because I have a positive attitude towards the organization. My positive attitude towards my boss also helps me to defend myself, in the sense that if my boss is less than honest in an organization, I tend to ignore that dishonesty in him. And that is how the attitude that I have of positive effectivity towards my boss helps me to defend my ego, defend my judgment about my boss. That's another function that attitude performs. And the third function that attitude performs is that it helps to express values. Value expression function of attitude means that the attitude of a person in the overall sense, in the overall expression of his life, helps him in properly expressing the values that he holds near. My positive attitude, for instance, towards my organization helps me to spread the good word about my organization around me. My positive attitude towards my boss helps me to spread the good word about my boss around me. And that is the third function of attitude. और भी attitudes के functions हैं, but for the time being at this level, you need to know only these three. Now, my question to you again is, do you think attitude can be measured? Give it a guess. When we were talking about measurement of personality, I asked you the same question. And we came to the conclusion that if something exists, scientific knowledge says it can also be measured. And we know that attitudes exist. If attitudes exist, if an attitude exists, then it can be measured. It's very logical and it's very scientific. Tell me, can you measure brand loyalty? Tell me, can you measure patriotism? Tell me, can you measure a person's attraction for an organization? Relevant questions, aren't they? Brand loyalty, patriotism, a person's attraction for an organization, an attitude, various aspects of personality. They don't exist in material, tangible forms, do they? But they can still be measured. Can they not be? Of course they can. Various aspects of personality do not exist in material form, but we have been able to measure them. Similarly, attitudes may not exist in material forms, but we can measure them. We have developed a number of measures of attitudes, and organizational psychologists use a great deal of them. But we will talk about only some of the prominent ones here, because you obviously have covered attitudes in your lessons on social psychology. And you must have covered them in detail. So we will talk about just one or two attitude measures. One of the measures of attitude is what is called a rating scale, where a person rates his attitude as being negative or positive towards a given object, a person, or an ideology. We know that we can measure the attitude of students towards their teachers, their instructors. We know we can ask the students to rate their teachers on various dimensions. For instance, we may ask students to rate a teacher on the clarity of his expression. We may ask the students to rate a teacher on his ability to clarify a confusing point. We may ask students to rate teachers on the detailed expressions that teachers use in explaining a point. These are all examples of how students may rate a teacher for various qualities that the teacher may possess. The rating may take place from 1 to 5 or 1 to 7 or 1 to 10. For instance, the students may rate a teacher for his clarity of expression from 1 to 5 degrees. If his expression is not very clear, he might be given 1 mark, and if his expression is extremely clear, the teacher might be given 5 marks. All the students may rate a teacher like that. The students may rate the teacher on a number of such variables, as I just said, and that would measure one student's attitude towards the teacher or the attitude of the whole class towards that particular teacher. And that is an example of measurement of attitude so far as students are concerned in terms of rating scales. बहुत से लोगों ने ये रेटिंग स्केल्स मेजरमेंट ऑफ एटीट्यूड में इस्तेमाल की हैं. आपने पढ़ी होगी सोशल साइकोलॉजी में. थर्स्टन इज वन ऑफ देम. और भी को आप नाम ले सकते हैं. बोगार्डस इज अनदर स्केल. ये स्केल्स जो हैं ये एटीट्यूड की मेजर्स हैं. हमने ये स्केलिंग सिस्टम, रेटिंग स्केल सिस्टम जो है, ये पिछली सदी की तकरीबन वस्त से शुरू किया, उससे भी पहले से शुरू किया हुआ है. और आजकल हमने इन रेटिंग स्केल्स को बहुत ज्यादा एडवांस कर लिया है. सो रेटिंग स्केल इज वन ऑफ द मेजर्स ऑफ एटीट्यूड. You could measure the attitude of a person in an organization towards his leader using a rating scale. You could measure a person's attitude towards his co-workers using a rating scale. You could measure a person's attitude towards his subordinates using a rating scale. You could measure a person's attitude towards the opposite gender in the organization using a rating scale. There are various ways in which rating scales may be used to measure attitudes in organizational psychology. That's one of the ways in which attitudes may be measured. But that's an old technology. Relatively recent technology of measurement of attitude is what is called the semantic differential scales. Not a rating scale, but a semantic differential scale. A semantic differential scale is one which measures attitude in terms of 7 semantic spaces or 7 categories. For instance, you might measure a person's attitude towards the organization as being highly positive, somewhat positive, don't know, somewhat positive, negative, and highly negative. What have you got here? You've got 7 categories of responses that the subject or a person whose attitude you are measuring may select. And that is an example of a semantic differential scale. इसकी क्या वजह थी कि हमने semantic differential scale क्यों बनाई? क्योंकि 60 और 70 की दिहाई में माहिरीन नफ्सियात ने यह महसूस किया कि जब वो रवैये की पैमाइश करते हैं तो रवैये की पैमाइश के लिए जो अल्फाज वो इस्तेमाल करते हैं उन अल्फाज से मुतल्लिक किसी मामूल के ज़हन में अबहाम हो सकता है. Psychologists in the 60s and 70s realized that using words to measure attitudes may give rise to confusion because words may have different meanings for different subjects. And that is why they decided to use a scaling method which made use of semantic spaces and which helps to do away with the confusion that might exist in the minds of people related to different words that are used. And that is the justification for developing a semantic differential scale for the measurement of attitude. आपने डिटेल से ये सोशल साइकोलॉजी में और मेजरमेंट ऑफ एटीट्यूड में पढ़ी होगी. सो वी विल लीव इट एट दैट. I just want you to be aware of the fact that attitudes are measured using various techniques. One of the techniques is the rating scale. Another technique of measurement of attitude is semantic differential scale, and we measure attitudes because attitude impact organizational behavior, and in turn they get affected by people's presence in an organization by the very fact of organizational psychology. Let us go forward of that. Once an attitude has been measured, once people in the organization know that A may have a negative attitude towards his co-workers, towards his opposite gender, towards a leader, towards a manager, then that negative attitude needs to be changed. मैं आपको एक और इसकी मिसाल से एक्सप्लेनेशन देता हूं. मिसाल के तौर पर आपको एक ऐसा शख्स चाहिए जो आपकी एडवर्टाइजिंग कैंपेन बड़ी अच्छी तरह से बनाए. आपने बहुत सी तहकीक के बाद और मुख्तलिफ सिलेक्शन प्रोसीजर्स जो निहायत साइंटिफिक सिलेक्शन प्रोसीजर्स हैं, उनको इस्तेमाल करते हुए आपने एक शख्स को सिलेक्ट किया हु इज हाईली क्रिएटिव, whose creativity is beyond any shadow of doubt. So you know that he will be a valuable asset to the organization, to the marketing department, and particularly to making advertising campaigns. But that person that you have hired has a negative attitude towards the CEO of the organization. He thinks, rightly or wrongly, he thinks that the CEO is a biased person. He thinks that the CEO is a negative person. He thinks that the CEO is a prejudiced person. He thinks that the CEO should not be a man, it should be a woman. He may have dozens of reasons. So what are you going to do? As an organizational psychologist, you would not hire him because he has a negative attitude towards the CEO, the chief executive officer, but you are hiring him not for his negative or positive attitude towards this chief executive officer. You are hiring him because you want him to use his creativity and to make an advertising campaign which will be a masterful campaign and be able to sell your product. But the man has a negative attitude. Should you change his attitude? Of course you should. And that is how organizational psychologists come into play. They help to change attitudes. Let me give you another example. You have an organization where both males and females work together. In any organization, for it to be successful, the organization has to base its selection policy only on merit. It should hire only people who have merit, regardless of their gender, whether they are males or females, whether they are young or old, whether they are Sayyads or non-Sayyads, whether they are blacks or whites, whether they are Punjabis or Sindhis. All of these things have to be ignored, and only their talent has to be taken into consideration. When you hire people on the basis of their talent, then you will hire people who have certain negative baggage that comes with them. For instance, you may hire somebody or some people who have a negative attitude towards the opposite sex, towards the opposite gender. A male may have a prejudiced view of the females, and a female may have a prejudiced, jaundiced view of the males working in the organization. So what have we got here? We have got the best talent, but the best talent has negative attitudes. So what are we going to do? Are we going to hire people for positive attitudes alone? Or are we going to hire people for talent and experience and facility with the job rather than their attitude? Obviously, their talent, facility, and education and experience, and not their attitudes. So once they are hired, and once it's discovered by organizational psychologists that they abound in, they have excess talent, but along with that talent, the negative attitude also comes. So what are they going to do? Fire them? No. Change their attitude. And hence the need to changing of attitudes in organizational psychology. Organizational success के लिए ये निहायत ज़रूरी है कि लोगों को उनके टैलेंट के बेसिस पर हायर किया जाए. और जब टैलेंट के बेसिस पे हायर किया जाता है तो लोगों के बायसेस और प्रेजुडिस भी बीच में शामिल हो जाते हैं, और उन बायसेस और प्रेजुडिसेस की वजह से, तासुबात की वजह से लोगों के रवैये जो हैं वो मनफी भी होते हैं. और इन मनफी रवैयों को दुरुस्त करना, चेंज करना निहायत जरूरी फंक्शन है किसी भी ऑर्गेनाइजेशनल साइकोलॉजिस्ट का. और यही हम देखना चाहते हैं कि क्या एटीट्यूड को चेंज किया जा सकता है. आप बताइए, एटीट्यूड को चेंज किया जा सकता है या नहीं? जी हां, एटीट्यूड को चेंज करना मुश्किल है, लेकिन एटीट्यूड को मॉडिफाई करना आसान है. इसलिए अगर हम ये कहें कि चेंजिंग एटीट्यूड इज डिफिकल्ट but modifying attitude is relatively easy, then yes, we can change attitudes. And how can we change attitudes? A number of factors. But first, let us look at a basic ingredient of a hindrance in the change of an attitude. The main hindrance in the change of an attitude can be described as barriers. And what are those barriers? There are two barriers that stand in the way of change of attitudes. What are those two barriers? Insufficient information. One of the barriers which stops a person from changing his attitude is insufficient information. An example of that would be that insufficient information regarding a person might lead another person to have a negative attitude towards the first person. For instance, the person who has a worker who has a negative attitude towards his boss, that may be based upon insufficient information, but only on a limited experience. The worker finds the boss to be bad-tempered all the time, but he does not know why is the manager or the leader bad-tempered. The information of the worker who has a negative attitude is insufficient. If he is told that the manager is bad-tempered because manager's poor wife, Khuda na khasta, is suffering from terminal cancer and she is dying, if that information is provided to the worker, do you think the worker would still have a negative attitude towards his boss? Of course not. The probability is that the worker, after having been given this information, may change or modify his attitude. He may say that his boss is justified in being temperamental or bad-tempered because he is witnessing or going through a most tragic period of his life. His wife is dying of a terminal cancer. May God forgive all of us and all of you from that. And that is an extreme example of insufficient information being a barrier. The person, the worker, did not know, did not have sufficient information about the other person, therefore had this negative attitude about the other, in relation to the other person. Another reason for a lack or rigidity of attitude, or when it is difficult to change attitude, is that a person might have a prior commitment. One of the barriers is a prior commitment in the change of attitude. Suppose a person is politically committed to vote for a party or a candidate. He has committed himself to vote for a candidate and a party, and because of that, he refuses to change his attitude, he refuses to modify it. Even when that person knows that the candidate and the party may not fulfill their political promises. And that is a barrier to attitude, a prior commitment. Even when it is exposed that the political person has been taking bribes because the voter has already committed himself to vote for his candidate, he remains loyal to his commitment. And that is another barrier, a prior commitment. Two barriers in changing or modification of attitude we have seen. Number one, lack of information or insufficient information, and prior commitment. What are some of the technologies of change of attitude? How can we do it? ये तो हमने देख लिया कि ये बैरियर्स हैं. अब इसके क्या तरीके होंगे कि हम एटीट्यूड को बदलें? आप एज ए साइकोलॉजिस्ट इन एन ऑर्गेनाइजेशन, आपको ये तो पता चल गया कि एक शख्स का दूसरे शख्स की तरफ या दूसरे ग्रोह की तरफ मनफी रवैया है, और इस वजह से है कि इनसफिशिएंट इंफॉर्मेशन है, और इस वजह से है कि उसकी प्रायर कमिटमेंट है. अब इसको बदलेंगे कैसे आप? बिल्कुल आपने ठीक अंदाजा लगाया. पहली वही बात जिस पे हमने अभी जिक्र किया था कि अगर इनसफिशिएंट इंफॉर्मेशन है तो उसकी इंफॉर्मेशन को प्रोवाइड कर देना चाहिए. प्रोवाइडिंग न्यू इंफॉर्मेशन, प्रोवाइडिंग एडेड इंफॉर्मेशन, providing different information, providing more rich and varied information would help to do away with insufficient information, and insufficient information was the cause of a person not changing his attitude. So when you provide him different or sufficient information, he is ready to change his attitude. That's number one. Number two, अभी हमने दूसरी चीज क्या देखी थी कि बैरियर क्या है? प्रायर कमिटमेंट. सो व्हाट शुड बी द स्ट्रेटजी? व्हाट वुड यू डू टू चेंज एटीट्यूड ऑफ अ पर्सन हु इज कमिटेड टू समवन, टू समबॉडी, और एन एटीट्यूड beforehand? You will find the prior commitment and break that commitment. If a person is committed to vote for a candidate and a party, you find out why is he committed, and then find ways and means of breaking that commitment. And that's another way of changing an attitude. We discovered 2 barriers and then we discovered 2 strategies of changing attitudes. Barriers were insufficient information, so we provide other information. Barrier was prior commitment, so we find out the prior commitment and we try and demolish it, we try and break it. इसके अलावा और भी strategies हैं. वो क्या हैं? Use of fear, or one should say use of punishments and rewards, जिसको अंग्रेजी मुहावरा में कहा जाता है carrot and sticks. Carrot and stick means that you give him incentives or reinforcements and rewards for changing his attitude, and you give him punishment or negative reinforcement for remaining loyal to his attitude. That's another way of changing attitude or modifying attitude. When a person modifies or changes, he is rewarded. When a person remains in his attitude, he is punished. और punishment जरूरी नहीं है कि वो physical punishment हो, punishment जरूरी नहीं है कि वो harsh हो. There are hundreds of ways of punishment in organizations. जब हम इसका डिटेल से जिक्र पढ़ेंगे तो हम ये भी आपको बता देंगे कि punishment के क्या क्या मुख्तलिफ तरीके हो सकते हैं, starting with the most mild and ending up with the most severe. For instance, lack of eye contact between a person might be punishment. For instance, writing a note might be punishment. For instance, not giving him enough raise might be punishment. For instance, reprimanding him might be. There are so many ways of punishing. As there are many ways of rewarding. For instance, shaking hands with somebody. For instance, making eye contact with somebody. For instance, giving him shabash for good work may be a reward. All of these are rewards and punishments. So rewards and punishments may be used to change attitudes. एक और तरीका है एटीट्यूड को चेंज करने का जो कि हमारे कुंबे में, हमारे खानदानों में, पाकिस्तान और मुख्तलिफ खित्तों में इस्तेमाल किया जाता है. That is to use family and friends to pressurize somebody to change attitudes. आप जानते हैं कि अगर घर में कोई यंग नौजवान लड़की या लड़का शादी से इनकार करे तो बड़े बूढ़े कहते हैं उसके दोस्तों को, उसके जानने वालों को, इसको समझाइए ये शादी कर ले. और उनके समझाने से वो शख्स या वो खातून मान भी जाती हैं. And that is an example of change of attitude. Influencing friends and family. And family and friend then pressurize the person to change his attitude. That's another element, or that's another strategy for change of attitude. Another one is co-opting. In technical language, co-opting means involving some person in decision-making process. Attitude can be changed if the person is asked to become a part of the decision-making process. मिसाल के तौर पर अगर ऑर्गेनाइजेशन में आप ये देखें कि ऑर्गेनाइजेशनल प्रोडक्शन जो है वो कम हो रही है, मिसाल के तौर पर आपने 5000 गज कपड़ा बनाना है मिसाल के तौर पर, और एक माह में या एक हफ्ते में, और वो 5000 कपड़ा जो आपने प्रोड्यूस करना है वो 4000 बन रहा है. यू वांट टू रेज दैट लेवल. हाउ वुड यू गेट पीपल टू get more productive, be more involved in raising the productivity level? By inviting them to make a decision whether it is possible to make 5,000 yards or not, or if you could make them possible, make 6,000 yards possible. Here what you are doing is that you are involving other people in decision making. Those people who are not giving their best, their productive capacities to making the cloth, would now be involved in decision making and therefore would change their attitude. Co-opting is another methodology in which attitudes might be changed. और आखिर में हम कहते हैं कि अगर ये तमाम चीजें भी कारआमद ना हो तो फिर an organizational psychologist refers the person whose attitude is required to be changed to a psychotherapist. Psychotherapy, therefore, is another technology in which attitude may be changed. In case of very valuable workers in organizations, if that valuable worker has a negative attitude towards, for instance, the CEO, the Chief Executive Officer, and all other technologies of change of attitude have failed, then the organizational psychologist may refer that talented worker for psychotherapy. Modern organizations employ psychotherapists on an ongoing basis, where they intervene and help people to change attitudes and thereby raise the individual productivity and the productivity of the entire organization as a whole. That is how we may change the attitude of people in organizations. Before we end today, let us see what we talked about. We talked about attitude having three components, that is, cognitive, conative, and affective components. Then we talked about the functions of the attitudes, and we saw that attitude helps to adjust individuals, attitude helps to defend the ego, and attitude has a value expressive function also. फिर हमने एटीट्यूड की मेजरमेंट देखी थी और उसमें हमने रेटिंग स्केल की और सीमेंटिक डिफरेंशियल स्केल का जिक्र किया था, और फिर हमने ये देखा था कि क्या एटीट्यूड जो है वो चेंज किए जा सकते हैं. हमने कहा हाँ, और हमने देखा कि उसके बैरियर्स और प्रायर कमिटमेंट और इनसफिशिएंट इंफॉर्मेशन जो है ये बैरियर्स हैं. और फिर हमने देखा कि इनको एटीट्यूड्स को चेंज करने का क्या तरीका है, और हमने कहा कि इंफॉर्मेशन प्रोवाइड की जाए, कमिटमेंट को ब्रेक किया जाए, रिवॉर्ड्स एंड पनिशमेंट्स को इस्तेमाल किया जाए, को ऑप्टिंग किया जाए, फ्रेंड्स एंड फैमिली को इन्फ्लुएंस किया जाए, और साइकोथेरेपी. ऑल ऑफ दीज help to change attitude. Once the attitude becomes positive, it helps the organization a great deal. So it is worthwhile the organizational psychologists to change people's attitude, particularly if those attitudes are negative in an organization. We will talk more on this in the next lecture. Until that time, do take a look at these things that we've talked about. Khuda Hafiz, God be with you.